Legality of consideration and object, Section 23. Under the Indian Contract Act, 1872, a contract is valid only when its consideration and object are lawful. This rule is provided under Section 23 of the Act. Consideration means something given in return for a promise, while object means the purpose for which the agreement is made. Both must be legal, otherwise the agreement becomes void. According to the Act, the consideration or object of an agreement is unlawful if it is forbidden by law or if it defeats the provisions of any law. An agreement is also unlawful if it involves fraction or deception, if it is immoral, or if it is against public policy. In all such cases, the law refuses to recognize the agreement. When the consideration or object is unlawful, the agreement becomes void, and no legal rights or obligations arise from it. Courts will not help either party, as enforcing such agreements would be against law and public interest. Meaning of consideration and object. Consideration means something given or promised in return for a promise. Object means the purpose or reason for which the agreement is made. Both must be legal, otherwise, the agreement becomes void. When consideration or object is unlawful. According to Section 23, the consideration or object of an agreement is unlawful if forbidden by law. Under Section 23 of the Indian Contract Act, 1872, an agreement is void if its consideration or object is forbidden by law. This means that if any law expressly prohibits doing a particular act, an agreement to do that act cannot be valid. When the object or consideration of a contract involves an act that is illegal or punishable under law, the court will not enforce such an agreement. The purpose of this rule is to ensure that contracts do not promote or support illegal activities. For example, an agreement to sell illegal drugs, an agreement to commit a crime, or an agreement to bribe a public servant is forbidden by law and therefore void. Even if both parties agree willingly, such agreements have no legal validity. Thus, any agreement whose consideration or object is forbidden by law is void ab initio, and courts will refuse to recognize or enforce it in order to protect law and public interest. Defeats the provisions of any law. Under Section 23 of the Indian Contract Act, 1872, an agreement is unlawful if its object or consideration defeats the provisions of any law. This means that even if an act is not directly forbidden by law, an agreement made to indirectly avoid, bypass, or defeat the purpose of the law is also considered unlawful. Such agreements are made in a clever or indirect way to achieve something which the law does not permit. The law looks at the real intention behind the agreement and not just its form. For example, an agreement made to evade tax, an agreement to transfer property to defeat the rights of creditors, or an agreement to bypass statutory restrictions is void because it defeats the provisions of law. Thus, agreements which indirectly violate the law or frustrate its purpose are treated as unlawful and void, and courts will not enforce them. Fraudulent. Under Section 23 of the Indian Contract Act, 1872, an agreement is unlawful if its object or consideration is fraudulent. This means that if the purpose of the agreement is to cheat, deceive, or commit fraud, the agreement is void. Fraudulent agreements are made with the intention of causing loss to another person or gaining an unfair advantage by dishonest means. The law does not support or protect such agreements because they are against justice and fairness. For example, an agreement to sell stolen property, an agreement to cheat a third person, or an agreement to obtain money by false representation is fraudulent and therefore void. Thus, when the object or consideration of an agreement is fraudulent, the agreement has no legal effect, and courts will refuse to enforce it in order to prevent dishonesty and injustice. Immoral. Under Section 23 of the Indian Contract Act, 1872, an agreement is unlawful if its object or consideration is immoral. Immoral agreements are those which are against moral values, decency, and good conduct accepted by society. The law does not define the term immoral strictly, but courts decide it according to social standards and public conscience. Agreements that encourage or promote immoral acts are considered void. For example, an agreement for illegal sexual relations, an agreement to maintain a concubine, or an agreement to encourage prostitution is considered immoral and therefore void. Thus, agreements based on immoral objects or considerations are not enforceable by law, as enforcing them would be against public morality and social welfare. Against public policy. Under Section 23 of the Indian Contract Act, 1872, an agreement is unlawful if its object or consideration is against public policy. Public policy refers to the welfare, interest, and safety of the public at large. Agreements that harm society or go against public interest are not supported by law. The courts do not encourage agreements that may injure public morals, public justice, or public welfare. Such agreements are declared void because enforcing them would be harmful to society. Examples of agreements against public policy include agreements to bribe public officials, agreements to suppress criminal proceedings, agreements that interfere with the administration of justice, or agreements restraining a person's legal rights unlawfully. Thus, agreements against public policy are void and unenforceable, as the law aims to protect society and ensure justice, morality, and public good. Effect of unlawful consideration or object. Under the Indian Contract Act, 1872, when the consideration or object of an agreement is unlawful, as provided under Section 23, the agreement becomes void and has no legal effect. Such an agreement is not enforceable by law from the very beginning. When consideration or object is unlawful, no legal rights or obligations arise between the parties. The courts will not help either party to recover any benefit under such an agreement, as doing so would support an illegal or immoral act. Further, collateral agreements connected with the unlawful agreement also become void if they are dependent on the illegal transaction. The law follows the principle that a person cannot claim relief from an agreement based on illegality. Thus, the effect of unlawful consideration or object is that the agreement is void ab initio, unenforceable, and rejected by courts in order to protect law, morality, and public interest. Example. If A agrees to pay B money to commit a crime, both the consideration, money, and object, crime, are unlawful, so the agreement is void. Conclusion. In conclusion, the legality of consideration and object is an essential requirement for a valid contract under the Indian Contract Act, 1872. If the consideration or object of an agreement is forbidden by law, defeats the provisions of law, is fraudulent, immoral, or against public policy, the agreement becomes void and unenforceable. Courts do not support agreements based on illegality, as enforcing them would harm law, morality, and public interest. Therefore, only agreements made for lawful purposes are recognized and protected by law.